Science Fair. Warm welcome to this debate on science for sustainable chemicals and waste management in the 21st century. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Payet, Executive Secretary of the Triple Conventions, who will say a few words.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming at this lunchtime to our side event. And I would like to thank our AUKUS panel here. I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here, and please enjoy the panel.
So this afternoon we will hear and we will discuss how the scientific community can support the sustainable management of chemicals and waste. I'm sure you know it better than I do, but with more than 1,000 new chemicals introduced every year, the question is a valid one. How can science help informing governments, informing the public, alerting governments, I assume sometimes, informing the consumers about all these new chemicals and the effects they can have on our health and our environment? I think I can say without any doubt that we have an impressive panel with us this afternoon. They all have had several lives. So I won't explain all the different lives. You have received bios. You have received bios for every one of them. But read them. The profile is inspiring, and clearly they advanced, they helped advancing the chemical and waste agenda for sure. So really happy that we have an impressive panel with us this afternoon. We also count on you to raise questions. You know, that's the objective of a panel discussion. I'll have questions. I hope the audience will also have questions. And maybe before we start with the first set of questions for... Maybe, yeah? Do you hear me? Yeah? Maybe before we start with the first set of questions, I would like to see and to know who we have in the room. Do we have national delegations? Do we have government people in the room? Please raise your hands. Yeah, we have got a number of... Do we have scientists? Of course we can be both. Scientists in the room? Okay, good. Do we have decision makers? Not yet. Tomorrow's decision makers. Do we have NGOs? Yeah, at the back here. Okay, so a good combination of indeed the policy officers and then scientists, and it's excellent because we want to discuss this, the policy-science interface. So now I will start with the first question, the same question to all the panelists. It's an easy one. When we do interviews, we say start with an easy question, and then the tough questions will come from you, I hope. So my first question is, in your view, and with your great experience, what are the two key challenges that we are facing regarding chemicals and waste today? And how do you think science can help ensuring a more sustainable management? I would like to start with Ambassador Lugris from Uruguay, and just mention one thing about your great career, that he is one of the key architects of the new Treaty on Mercury, Minamata Convention. He has successfully run the negotiations between 2010 and 2014. So bravo, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, and Excellency, I'm giving you the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I don't know if the mic is working. Allô, allô? Oui. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation, and thank you very much to the BRS Secretariat, and very especially to Rolf and Abiola for bringing back science into the discussions of BRS. I think this is a great timing for all of us to discuss about science, and I think your question is in the center of our preoccupations. We are here in Geneva attending those very intensive and exciting COPs, but we have to keep in mind that the objective of the three conventions is to protect human health and the environment. And for that, we need science. And I think it is important that we think that science plays a key role in all our work at the international arena. And I'm going to refer clearly on what are the discussions that we're having internationally. And I think this panel discussion takes place in a perfect moment, because we are in the middle of a BRS COP, but because we are also discussing a new regime for climate. We are also welcoming a new convention on mercury. We're also thinking in the future of ozone. So this is a great moment for the international community because we are facing a lot of environmental crisis, because human health is still and remains in the center of our preoccupation, but also because the UN is discussing the big post-2015 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And science is very much required in all those discussions as a tool, as a very important element to inform our decisions. And I was surprised that nobody raised their hands saying we are decision makers. I believe all of you are decision makers because you are attending a very important COPs, and those COPs are legally binding instruments, and the decisions that you are taking these weeks have a legal value that is very important, and you are regulating a very important aspect of our lives, and chemicals are part of our daily life. And we all know that, but actually everybody has to understand that we are facing a lot of challenges. And science is present in our work, and it has to be more present. And I think we need to foster the dialogue between the academia, the universities, the research centers, and all the other sectors. The public opinion obviously needs to receive more clear information, receive clear messages. I think we live in a world full of information, but also with a lot of confusion. And we need clear messages coming from the research centers. But also we need to get very clear, we need to translate what science is bringing to the negotiators and to the decision makers. And this translation of science to policy makers is absolutely vital, and it is vital in different steps. So when we are talking about BRS, those are legally binding instruments. We know them by heart, but those are alive. I mean, we are still in a COP because we need to develop new guidance, new ideas in order to fully implement the objectives that are contained in those agreements, but also in many other MEAs around. And science was and is fundamental in order to identify a problem that is of a global concern that needs a common action by the international community. So it is absolutely essential, and it has been essential in order to identify those global issues. And of course, one of my first missions when I was posted here in Geneva in the year 2000 was to attend the first meeting when we came as international community with the global assessment on mercury. And it was basically when we gathered all the scientific information, and politically we took the decision that that was an issue of global concern. Then it took us some years for the international community to say, okay, what kind of action are we going to take? And the decision was, let's develop a legally binding instrument. Then we faced a new step, how to develop a legally binding instrument to regulate mercury and mercury pollution and the impact to health and the environment. For all that, we needed science. We needed a clear indication from science on which kind of control measures we could agree or not to agree. So in the development of international environmental law, the good use of science is absolutely fundamental. Once we get a convention or we get an agreement, then we need to implement it. And for the implementation, for the full implementation worldwide of those instruments, we need science, and we need technological development, and we need new tools in order to really fully implement and achieve the objectives that we have in front of us. But then we also need science in order to evaluate the efficiency of those conventions. Because are we perfect as negotiators? No. We only reach consensus on what we can or with the information that we have available. But probably science is giving us new answers, new challenges, and we also need to measure the efficiency of the implementation of our instruments, and for that we need monitoring systems. And you know, during my journey with the mercury negotiations, I attended all the scientific big meetings of mercury, and I was really impressed looking at PhDs and post-PhDs presentations and amazing information that was out there. But I also have to recognize in this very international space that we are here that we don't always get information from all the parts of the world. And it is our duty to get information and to have monitoring system worldwide. when I was attending all the mercury scientific meetings, there was 80% of the information coming from the north. And that could give us a wrong piece of information to take an informed decision if we don't get all the information of the whole planet and what's going on in the south. So one of my my ideas that I would like to throw to you in order to get more information is I am aware, because I'm coming from a very southern, one of the southernmost points in the planet, that there are a lot of universities also researching in the south, but there are some gaps, and we need to bring our research centers from the south with the north and try to bring all this information together, because we need science. And I think the clear message is we need it in order to develop those instruments. We need them to keep developing the instruments, to keep them alive. We need, in order to assess and evaluate how efficient we are. Do we have less POPs now than 20 years ago when we were in Johannesburg at INC5 or not? This is an answer that we need to get clearly out of this meeting. In 20 more years, are we going to have less mercury emissions or more? I mean, are we being efficient as UN? So I think all those questions deserve a clear answer from the science and a very good dialogue between science, policymakers, and the public opinion. And the public opinion needs to be aware in order to continue to push on us, on our work.
Thank you, Excellency. So if I hear you well, we need to fill the gaps, and we also need to reinforce the dialogue between the science community and then let's say the political community. One question, because I think the mercury story is a good story, is a great story, and it's a new story. You said discussion started in 2000. Would you say it was led by the political world or by the scientific world who alerted you?
Well, in the case of Minamata, I think there were so many severe crises that there was also a human aspect and a human rights crisis, I would say. I mean, Minamata means a lot to the international community. So there was also the voices of the victims of pollution that spoke very clearly to the international community. But of course, we needed decades in order to digest this tragedy that took place in our planet, and that is still taking place in many parts of the world due to other issues like artisanal small-scale gold mining nowadays. So yes, there were the voice of the public opinion, the scientific research that came and said, yes, this is the information that we have. It's not something that took place once due to a factory somewhere there in the north. It is something that is taking place all around the world. It's an issue of global concern. So science played a fundamental role for countries to say, yes, we need to take a global action.
Good. So we now have your first two challenges that we will keep in mind. And moving on to Fatoumata Keita-Ouane, who is the former head of the chemicals branch of the UN Environment Programme. Thank you for joining us. I think what's interesting with your career is that you've worked for both WHO and UNEP, so you really well cover both aspects, the health dimension and the environment dimension. So now over to you for your two challenges and then the key role of the scientific community.
Thank you. This is working. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, all of you. I'm so happy to see all already known faces and friends. And thank you, Ambassador Lugris, for placing the needs that we have of scientific information and what science can do to support sound management of chemicals. And your last question about what initiated the discussions around mercury, whether it's science or whether it's policymakers, there is a third stakeholder that's extremely important, and these are the consumers, the public opinion, and we cannot ignore that. I remember a long time as I was entering in the international system as a young toxicologist, as one of the UK professors saying that the regulators were running in front of the knife held by consumers, and this is extremely powerful. And to have informed consumer is extremely powerful in achieving sound management of chemicals. And this is done mainly if the scientific information that's available is translated in understandable and usable information for the consumers, for the public, and for decision makers. So this is one of the elements. The accessibility of information is critical in terms of sound management of chemicals. But then what information? I'd like very briefly you mentioned that information is needed. We do have more information now than half a century ago, but still we are having problems. And talking about sound management of chemicals, it's really peculiar in this information age that we talk about the need for having information and understandable information. But it's a fact, and we have to admit that. We look at around Rachel Carson in the 60s, and I'm ashamed to refer to that. There should be more recent references, but we cannot ignore this reference because we are still facing the same situation. Said we are putting poisonous substances, biologically potent, in the hands of people who are ignorant of their potential to harm. Is that different now? And she said, we are using these chemicals, allowing the use of chemicals without advanced investigation of their effect on air, water, and the man. Probably we are more advanced in terms of investigation. We do have data, but we are still facing a problem of integrating the data, and that will be my second element. So first is the consumer power and understanding of information. And this second one is how we do integrate information in order to support chemicals, sound management, and sound decision-making. There are a lot of scientific disciplines not talking necessarily to each other, and we need them to talk to each other. We need science to talk to their. We need science to also integrate other disciplines, economies, policies, regulations, and law to be able to have real sound decisions and to be able to translate the data into information. And when we talk about integration, this integration will enable us to know the cost, the impact of pollution of chemicals, but also to know the cost of not acting on them. Cost of inaction, very important, because this is what is required so that the paradigm of chemical management changes. It's not anymore, we have to do something because it's good to do. We have to do something because we are requested to do. We have to do something because if we don't do, the cost is unbearable. And if we do it, the benefits are outstanding. So this is another element that I would like to mention. And just briefly, maybe if I'm allowed, a third one, consensus building, the role of science in reaching consensus building. And there is one recent example that I would like to mention here, and this is, we have this heat debate over the endocrine disrupting substances. Some says yes, some says no. It's good, it's bad, it's not so bad. It's important, it's everywhere, not so much of it. So how do we address this debate and make consensus? And the scientific community has an important role. And a group of scientists have come together and look at the debate and the divergence of views for EDCs and said, okay, wait, let's look at what is dividing people and how we can help focus the debate around these points that are dividing so we can get to understanding. And then they come with definitions. Are we all using the same definitions? Are we talking about the same thing? Methodology. What are the methods we are talking about? And how can we ensure that these methods there is consensus about the methods so we can have consensus about the results, and so on and so forth. And this is an important element also of the scientific community to build consensus. And there is so much, I would say, alternatives to chemicals are important. I cannot close without talking about the Stockholm Convention, for which I worked for a number of years. it's extremely important that the scientific community engages in finding alternatives. We have looked and seen that finding alternatives is like getting to replace a hazardous substance by a new unknown. And science can help in getting out of this dilemma. I'll stop here. Otherwise, I guess somebody will say I went beyond my 3 minutes, and French speakers speak a lot.
Good. Thank you, Fatou. So we then keep in mind the consumer's power and the need to inform the consumers and then use the power. Again, the data is coming back, so I think that's clearly one of the key challenges that we have at the consensus building. Thanks for sharing those with us. And let's now move to Dr. Ivanova. You're an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, but you're also the science advisor to Mr. Ban. Thanks for being with us. To me, you are the incarnation of this science policy interface. So please, we'd like to hear your two challenges and then the role of the scientific community. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be here today and share with you the work that we in the social sciences are doing to bridge the divide between thinking about issues, doing something about them, and engaging a wider population. That includes the younger generation of today, students and the wider public. I'd like to build on what the previous two colleagues have talked about. To me, the major challenge is implementation. I would boil the two challenges to one challenge. It is implementation. It's implementing those agreements that decision makers, that governments have agreed to, and it's making sure that they actually deliver the results that they are supposed to deliver. And for that, the science policy interface is critical. And actually, we in our research group consider it the science policy society interface. Because you're absolutely right. It's not just the scientists and the policymakers. It's not even just adding the consumers. There's a larger society out there that is people who are defending consumers, who have the public good in mind, whether it's NGOs, various advocacy organizations, or even just citizens. And so that in that value chain of the science policy society interface, natural science is perhaps the first element to identify a problem. And that often spurs policy development. Policymakers then have to develop some response. Then uncertainties in science are often used to pull back from the policy development and, in a sense, sow a grain of doubt. Are we doing the right thing? Science is not completely certain. And then in a third stage, social scientists come in to actually present tools to measure, to explain, and to improve implementation. And that's the biggest challenge. We are not yet able to measure, to explain, and to improve implementation in a way that our actions match the needs of the day. And social science actually has not been adequately engaged in these debates. And I am honored to be one of the social scientists engaged in the science fair on chemicals and wastes. And I would like to share with you kind of an effort, an initiative that we at the University of Massachusetts, Boston are undertaking to spur some initiative on implementation. Because currently, there are no systematic assessments of the level of implementation of international treaties and conventions. Because of that, we have three problems. One, we don't have a baseline. We don't know where we stand in regard to what we have agreed to. Two, we cannot determine if the conventions are solving the problems that the conventions were created to resolve. Three, we cannot present a credible, systematic explanation of why performance differs across countries. Financial means are not enough of an explanation, and I will show you why. Because our work on creating an environmental conventions index takes 10 global conventions. We have done 6 so far, and Basel and Stockholm are among those, and takes all the national reports of all the countries members to all of these conventions and assesses to what extent are they performing on the obligations that these countries have agreed to. And we have results on the level of reporting and on the level of implementation. And I'm happy to say that the story is quite positive and actually quite counterintuitive. On the reporting side, the most interesting element is that the convention with the highest number of questions gets the highest reporting results. And that is not a chemicals convention, that is the Ramsar convention that has over 400 questions and a national average reporting rate of 90%, 9-0. For a comparison, Basel has about 20 questions and 4 tables and 52% reporting rate. Stockholm about 65 questions and 42% reporting rate. On the implementation side, it is not developed countries that perform better than in all of the conventions. It isn't. There are a number of developing countries that appear as good performers across all of the conventions. In every convention we look at, there is a mixture of developed and developing countries. For Basel, I am delighted to report that the #1 performer is Bulgaria, my own country, by the way. Mexico, Egypt, Malaysia are among the top 10 performers, along with countries such as Belgium, Austria, Slovakia, Germany, Luxembourg, and Canada. And you see that kind of assessment across all of the conventions. And so that leads us to the why question, and we're not there yet as a research effort, but this is where I'd appreciate discussing with you and see why are different countries performing differently, and what are the incentives, what are the opportunities that countries have to actually perform better. So my main message to this conference of the parties is threefold. One, engage all kinds of scientists. Engage the natural scientists, engage the social scientists, but also engage humanities scholars, those that raise awareness of not only consumers, but also just of people who care. Second, support initiatives that track and assess implementation. It's necessary to have a baseline in order to know where you're headed. And 3, this science fair is unique. I think all conventions should have a science fair that brings the different disciplines together and creates that kind of dialogue and transdisciplinarity that Fatou was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ivanova. Thank you for bringing this new dimension of implementation and also performance at country level. I hope that, as we've seen, we have a lot of national delegations, people in the room, that will also raise questions a little bit later. I just want to then turn the mic to the next speaker, Mr. Mark Davis. He's a senior officer at FAO. He's a specialist in agriculture and in pesticides management. He combines a very strong academic background with great field experience. And so the same question, your 2 key challenges and then the role of science.
Thank you, and thank you also for the opportunity to be here and to speak to this esteemed audience. I'm going to start with a very unscientific comment, which is there are still some seats available at the front if anybody wants to come forward and sit down. And then I'm going to move on to something else which refers to the audience towards the back there. And I'm going to make specific reference to that mountain of sandwiches that you demolished quite recently. Because without agriculture, none of those sandwiches would have been there. And that goes for pretty much everything you have eaten and will eat today and at any other point. Agriculture is fundamental to our existence. And agriculture, of course, is a sector that depends heavily on science. And science has made huge contributions to improving agriculture, to improving productivity, and to making those sandwiches, amongst other things, available to the entire rapidly growing population of this planet. So this really, thinking about agriculture and the relationship between science and agriculture is fundamental to our existence, and we really need to be paying attention to this. So I'd like to come back to some of the points that were raised by the previous speakers, and Fatou in particular talked about the issue of how science is interpreted. Now, if we're looking specifically at the use of chemicals in agriculture, we could ask ourselves, would those sandwiches have been there, and would they have been as tasty and wholesome as they are without chemicals? And there are some people in this room who would say, absolutely not, it couldn't be done. And there are other people in this room who would say, definitely, there's no question about it, we could have done it equally well, if not better, without chemicals. And who is going to interpret or determine which of those arguments is correct? It's not an easy thing to do, and yet, you as regulators and decision makers who are participating in these discussions have to make those decisions pretty much on a daily basis. The pesticide regulators that I work with on an ongoing basis have to decide every day, is it okay to use this chemical or is it not okay? And actually, that will come back at the end of what I'm going to say, but that's one of the fundamental issues that we need to be addressing, both from the policy and the scientific perspective. From the scientific perspective, the question is, we gather the data in terms of ecotoxicology, human toxicology, behavior of these chemicals in the environment, the ecological effects and so forth. We gather that data. It is hopefully being made available to the decision makers, who then have to go through a process of interpreting it. And interpreting that same data can be done completely differently from one country to another. There is no standard that says, if you have this data, this is the decision you reach. And so that science policy interface is a very fuzzy line, and it results in many different decisions. And again, we're seeing that here in our own discussions of these conferences of the parties. As chemicals arise for listing on the various conventions, and you'll remember, of course, that most of the chemicals that are listed both on Rotterdam and the Stockholm Convention are pesticides. But as these chemicals come forward to be listed, there is an extensive scientific evaluation and discussion that doesn't necessarily come forward with conclusive decisions. And then it's open to interpretation. And that interpretation is made by policymakers, not necessarily by scientists. So that interface exists there, whether we like it or not, and it's influencing our daily lives. And ultimately, it decides which of those chemicals are going to be available and which of them are going to be used, ultimately, to deliver that food to that table. Now, what I would like to think about is I think that science can actually take us in quite different directions. And I think if we consider agriculture as the manipulation or the harnessing of natural processes, which it is, then we can also look to natural processes for many of the solutions that today synthesized chemicals provide for us. So, just for example, there are fungi in the soil out there in Switzerland and in your own countries that are able to kill insects as effectively as insecticides do. Are we harnessing those as effectively as we could be? There are plants that have defense mechanisms that are triggered as soon as they're attacked by a pest, and they work as an alarm bell in the ecosystem to call in the predators. Isn't that amazing? Nature does that. Nobody synthesized it. It happens every day. There are plants that generate chemicals of their own that actually work as repellents for insects. And there are plants that generate guard mechanisms around themselves, their root systems, to prevent other plants from invading. So they have herbicidal, fungicidal, insecticidal mechanisms built into our natural environments that we're growing our crops in. And we don't know enough about them. We've only identified a fraction of the microbial life that exists in soil. So we only know just a tiny bit about what those organisms can do for us. We think we know a lot about what those microorganisms do to damage us, or our plants, or our human health, And therefore, we throw a lot of chemicals into the environment and into our bodies to try and protect ourselves from those organisms that we're particularly anxious about. But in doing so, we don't fully understand what we're doing to the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of the biota. So that's really where science, I think, needs to play a much more active role, particularly in the agricultural sector, looking at natural systems and how can we harness those better to provide us with the solutions that we need. The chemical paradigm that we're currently dependent on has fundamental faults. We spray chemicals over a broad area to try and attack tiny little organisms like this. Logically, that doesn't make very good sense. How can we do things differently to target those chemicals more specifically where they are going to be used? Or how can we bring the pests to the chemicals rather than the other way around? There are plenty of solutions out there, but we need more science. We need more delivery of that science to the end users, to the farmers that Fatou also referred to in the beginning of the discussion. So where does this take us in terms of messages that we here from this conference need to take away? And I think one of the key messages that I would like to transmit is that regulators are not simply a hurdle that producers of chemicals, for example, need to cross in order to get their chemical into the marketplace. Regulators can have a much more important and effective role to play in ensuring the sustainability of agricultural production systems. Because regulators can quite well, rather than just asking that yes-no question, is this chemical okay or not, they could quite feasibly be saying, what are the sustainable solutions that our farmers need in order to deal with the problems that they face? And that too should be a guiding message for the scientists, for the researchers. Science and research should be targeted to the needs of end users. And often that's not the case. Often science is driven by other needs or other mechanisms altogether. So it's not really two messages that I'm giving, it's a single combined message. Policy and science need to be closely integrated to ensure that the solutions that are being provided reflect the needs of end users and support sustainability. That's the message that I'd like to leave with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and it's an interesting thought. Yes, someone who wants to applaud. Of course, yes, it's an interesting thought of changing how we do things, and then also thinking of the natural processes or natural systems that are out there and that we should and could use much better. So I hope that the gentleman who wanted to applaud will have a good question for Mark in 3 minutes' time. I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Lucy Gilliam. She used to be a science advisor for the UK government, and then one day she decided to quit everything, and then start her passion and sail the Atlantic, exploring toxic pollution. So over to you, Lucy, and we'd like to hear your great expedition and the results of it. Thank you.
Okay, so I founded Exxpedition really as a response to challenges.
Sorry about that. Yeah, you can try again.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So I founded Exxpedition really as a response to challenges that I identified during my time working first as a research scientist and then as a science advisor in government. And I wanted to make a positive contribution to the communication of science, of chemicals, and to inspire people to make changes to their lives for a clean and healthy environment, and to support global governance initiatives like these COP meetings, Basel, Stockholm and Rotterdam. And during my time in government, I actually worked at the Science Policy Interface on the Stockholm Convention, and I worked within the Central Science Strategy team when I worked there as well, and worked on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I realised that there are huge gaps in the knowledge, and that many of the issues are very, very controversial. And I found it actually very confusing being a scientist in government and trying to make decisions and advise the policymakers, and wondered, how it would be for the public. And in general, when I was going out and speaking to people, I found that public understanding of chemical science was very, very poor. And there were some kind of false assumptions about how safe products are on the market. And they're like, you know, people would say to me, well, of course they're safe. If they're in the shops and I can buy it, then it must be safe. And I was like, well, actually, no. There's lots of evidence coming forward that these products are building up in our environment, that they're harming human health. And then people say, well, if that's the case, why aren't they being banned? And then you have to explain the length of time it takes for information to flow through science, for people to be able to make decisions, for policymakers to be able to take action. And I think you can see that with the Minamata Convention. You know, we first had signs that this was harming the environment and human health back in the 50s. And we're only just at a place now where globally we've signed an agreement and we're starting to think about action, but still countries are dragging their feet on implementation. You know, so that's we can't wait 60 years, you know, between identifying a problem and then, you know, solving it. So this is really why I kind of stepped out of government and I set up a campaign essentially. Fortunately, just before I left government, I met Emily Penn, who's a plastics activist and a sailor, and she'd been sailing around the world mapping the plastics problem, and she'd been working with the Five Jars Institute, looking at these big areas of plastic in the world's oceans. And she came to me with lots of questions, really, about the impact of plastics, not just on the oceans, what harm they're doing to the ecosystem there, but also what's happening with plastics in our lifestyle and how are plastics, you know, impacting on our health and how are those toxics impacting on our health. And really, we just came up with so many questions that we couldn't necessarily answer. And I say, well, you know, some of them are really controversial. You only have to dive into the literature of bisphenol A and speak to some of the industry, industry groups to understand just how controversial just that one chemical is, you know. And we might have banned it in bottles, but the industry is saying it's the second most produced plastic. You know, we can't live without it. So, you know, how do we make those decisions? And so she did really inspire me to jump ship, and we set up Exxpedition. And what is Exxpedition? Well, we are all women teams that sail across oceans researching plastics and toxics. We go out with manta trawl nets and we sample the surface of the oceans, and we also take water samples for a scientist called Dr. Anna Carmen, and she's looking at POPs in those samples. And we participate in a citizen science initiative which was founded by UNEP called the Safe Planet Initiative, and we're looking at our own personal body burdens. So we looked at 35 different chemicals in the blood of our crew, and we found 29 of them in significant amounts. And we found this to be the most powerful tool for communicating to the public. We've made a film about our adventures, and we've been showing that film, and afterwards we have Q&As, and people are really genuinely shocked to know that we, in our bodies, are contaminated by persistent organic pollutants. And one example is my skipper and co-founder, Emily. She has really high levels of flame retardants in her body, higher than all the other crew members. And, you know, we're thinking, why is that? And it's probably because she spent 6 months clearing up waste on Pacific islands where they don't have a solution for their waste. Their fisheries have collapsed. They're importing all their food. It all comes in plastics. They have computer waste sort of dumped on them inadvertently. People donate computers to these communities thinking they're doing good. And then to deal with that waste, they're just burning it. And, you know, and goodness knows what levels of contaminants are in their bodies if Emily has got high levels of flame retardants just from 6 months working there. So that's what we're doing with Exxpedition. We're creating these adventures. We're taking women on adventures to research plastics and toxics. Hopefully we're empowering them up to be kind of global ambassadors on the issues. And through kind of curating interdisciplinary teams, we've got artists, we've got scientists, we've got policymakers. We hope to come up with innovative solutions, not just to communicate to the public, but to inspire people to make more sustainable choices in their lifestyle and to come up with new inventions that hopefully can get chemicals, unsafe chemicals, out of our environment.
Thank you for sharing your passion, and then you again coming back to the challenge of informing the consumers and really informing citizens. I told you the panel is great. I told you at the beginning, I should have told you, and you know it probably, but the challenges seem to be huge. So I hope that we can also hear some of the solutions, and not only the threats and the fears that are associated with chemicals and waste. Maybe now the audience would like to have a question. We've heard a lot already, so happy to turn to you. If you can say who you are and then raise your question maybe to one of the panelists.
Yes, I'm Fernando. I come from the Philippines. I really appreciate this science fair. It gives us an opportunity to learn more. The topic, I think, is very much relevant to all of us. And my question, well, not really question, but really taking off from the different views of the panel, realizing that information is out there. It's not that easy to get. The point of access is always a question for developing countries. Perhaps another point will be in terms of affordability for this information that needs to be accessed. And perhaps more on implementing them is a question more of making sense out of so much information, and for the need to respond to the different needs at different levels, especially in terms of academia, profession, governance, policy, for example. In case of mercury, we've had discussions between the dentists, professional organizations, government on how to handle this, considering we have ratified Minamata. So my question is more making sense out of it, perhaps, but that'll be very much effort for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if someone wants to comment. Yes?
I would like to react and also to combine your comments with Maria's comments on implementation. And I think this is the right context to underline three times implementation, implementation, because we are here in the context of a BRS. We have 3 legally binding instruments that we need to fully implement them. And I think, yes, the challenge in developing countries is out there, and we cannot not mention it here. And that's why I'm very happy to see the regional centers, that they can play a very important role in assisting countries to develop their own national institutions in order to fully implement the provisions contained in those 3 conventions. But implementation is key, and we need to implement the 3 conventions that we have, and also the 4th convention that is coming into force hopefully next year. But there's another question. You are experts in chemicals and waste, and I would like to ask a question. If we take the list of chemicals that we have listed in BRS and Minamata, are we done? And the answer clearly is no. And we do have another very important instrument, that is the SICAM. And SICAM should be mentioned here. Because SICAM really covers all the rest, and all the rest, I think, is a huge amount of chemicals, because we live in a world which is full of chemicals, and they are not only the ones that we have already agreed in legally binding instruments that are the ones that count. Some of our countries face more challenges with other chemicals that are not contained in those 3 or 4 conventions that we have. So the question is how we can really achieve the goal of sound management of chemicals and waste by the year 2020, because this is a goal that we have reaffirmed in Rio+20, that we put it in Johannesburg some years ago, and basically we are getting there. And the question is, maybe to Fatu, which is my dear friend, who's an expert in SICAM, are we going to get there? My answer will be no. And I think we need to think in the future and how we can really achieve this goal of 2020, probably with more time, with more global efforts. And my personal view is that we need more of what we are hearing from FAO, I mean, agriculture and science thinking in production, but also I see some friends from the Ministry of Health of For instance, my country, we have a lot of scientists thinking in health. We also have science thinking in environment, but we need to think in sustainable development. And I think we have a fantastic occasion this year with the negotiations of the SDGs, of the Sustainable Development Goals, that they're going to really mark the agenda of the United Nations for the future and all our global effort for the future. Are we going to have chemicals and waste there clearly stated, and how can science contribute to that? Because, I mean, this is a political debate among diplomats in New York. I mean, we're not going to lie to you. I mean, this is not taking place among science, but we need the science behind all those informed decisions. And we are discussing, for instance, indicators, because if we're going to have a goal, we better have very clear indicators. And for that, I mean, negotiators, we need to get the right information coming from all the different sources and agencies. And I would like to know what Fatou is thinking about that from your experience.
Yes. Fatou, I told you that the tough questions would come. I didn't know would come from Ambassador Lugris, but it's over to you.
But it's coming. Thank you. But before that, maybe just a short input to the question asked by our friend from the Philippines around access to information and being able to make use of this information. The access to information is extremely important. And then there is a role to play by many people. But I will just cite two. The scientists, again and again and again, who need to become better communicators. In scientific studies, we are not taught to communicate. And this is extremely important, and we need to work on that. But then access to information is something we have been working on. I will not name again this terrible thing that I started working with in UNEP, which was the International Register for Potentially Toxic Chemicals. But just to say that the international community is aware of this difficulty of access to information and access for developing countries. And hopefully we are becoming wiser, and UNEP is putting in place something called UNEP Live. I would invite all of you, countries, NGOs, business, to take a look at it. The idea may not be still ripe. The way of doing may not be completely firm, but it's an idea, and it's here a project on the table that is addressing a need, and this need is how do we access this information in an understandable manner, in a selected manner. So these are two things. Fernando, are we getting to 2020 goals? I would say we can get to it if we don't take any more time for anything else, including eating, sleeping. 2020 is really at our doorstep. But even if we would take this time, there are things that are in place, and we have to realize that. You mentioned the conventions in place on chemicals, BRS, M again for Montreal, M again for Minamata, only cover a few dozens of chemicals. So we are not really yet at the 2020 goals, which is safe use of chemicals. But then there are other efforts that we all need to look into. And this is really the importance of all working together. There is the REACH, which the European Union has put in place. It's probably 10 years of existence. There is still a long way to go, but under the REACH, there is 146,000 chemicals that are pre-registered, and it's absolutely tremendous as amount. If in years to come we would have basic set of information on these 146,000 of chemicals, I think we will be very close to being able to say 2020 goals are in sight. So there are things that are being put in place and that are being done, and we need all to contribute to that. And of course, SAICM is another approach for which the European Commission is contributing, and the REACH is a contributor to the SAICM effort. I'm sure that will be done. But then the green chemistry. Green chemistry is being taught in a very intimate circle, and it should get out of this intimate circle and become more publicly known, and that's many people contribute to that, because this is really how, again, we will avoid what I called choosing the unknown, a new unknown to replace existing chemicals, and that will very much take us close to the 2020 goals.
Thank you, Fatou. We wanted to hear some solutions. I think Fatou gave us some, options and solutions. So we all have some readings for the weekend. UNEP Live, have a look at it. And I know that Jackie McGlade, who is running UNEP Live, will be with you tomorrow at another panel discussion. So you can have a chat with her about that. And so we must then read the REACH directive. Okay, we'll do that, we promise, Fatou. I know that Mark wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, I work for a UN organization. We're supposed to be diplomatic. We're supposed to be here at the service of our member countries. But I'm going to say something quite undiplomatic right now. I'm going to say, I think it's time we got angry. Because if we leave this meeting of the BRS COPS, and we go home and we say, we didn't manage to list those chemicals again, and we go home and we sit there passively waiting for scientists or policymakers from the UN to come and solve our problems for us, I'm telling you now, it's not going to happen, and we are not going to reach the 2020 goals. So the question is, what can we do to get angry and to make the people around us take notice of what it is we're angry about? I think Lucy's example is a perfect one. She realized, you realize that working in government has its limitations and is actually too slow to bring about real action. So what Fatou said right at the beginning about consumers being a prime motivator in the process, I think is absolutely true. And we can look at the food industry as well and learn from that, because it was consumers getting angry about contaminated food, about mad cow disease, about salmonella in eggs and contaminated chicken and so forth in the marketplace. Consumers got angry about it, and they said to the supermarkets, to the providers of food, we don't want this anymore. Make it change. So the retailers are now working as a major change force for agriculture, and they're a lot faster than policymakers are. Because when supermarkets say, I'm not going to buy your food if it's contaminated, the farmers change their practices because they want to continue selling their food. So there are ways that we can bring about change a lot faster than our biannual negotiations that actually move things forward incredibly slowly. And what needs to happen in order to bring about that level of change is that we need to get angry. And I think it's time for us to get angry.
Thank you for that good advice. So let's get angry. Who has a question? Or a solution?
Election results
today. Yes, please, if you can quickly say who you are.
I'm Petronella from Zimbabwe. My question is, which positive examples from the BRIS experience do you think would be useful to replicate in the wider chemicals and waste policy arena towards sustainable chemicals and waste management?
Who wants to take that? Fatou?
What is the first part?
Positive examples from BRS that we can
implementation. Okay, positive example. I have to come back to the Stockholm Convention that I probably know better, and there are a lot of steps in managing chemicals, but one of the key steps, and coming back to what Maria was saying about implementation, is measuring what you're implementing. And this is in the Stockholm Convention national implementation plans, there is the monitoring process that is absolutely crucial and important to understand what is around you. And besides the monitoring process, there is also the evaluation and assessment of the presence of the substances in terms of size and dimension, but also physical presence. And for a reason that we don't have to repeat, it's absolutely difficult to implement when you don't know what you can measure, when you can measure. So learning how to measure is an example from these conventions that should be better looked at in order to ensure that we are making progress.
If I can add some words to that one, I mean, being a negotiator myself, I have to say that one of the happiest moments in my career was when I was told that the PCBs of my countries were not only collected, but they were in a container direction to a large developing country that can deal with them, because at that moment, that was taking place. I mean, it was the sound management of chemicals and waste that was taking place in reality, and that was thanks to a Jeff project that we undertook. But this is, you know, a fact of reality. And, you know, when you see the implementation taking place not only in paperwork done by a consultant, but when you see the reality down in the field, those are the best moments. Those are the moments when you see that you are really implementing the convention, because at the end of the day, what we need to do is to take action in the field and to reach population. And I think there are several of those examples. I think we need many more examples like this one. But of course, there's another link. When a country is able to do that, to eliminate PCBs and to find the right solution to do it, then they can also translate or try to explain to other neighbor countries how to do it, and this exchange of information makes other countries follow the example if possible, and the regional centers can really amplify this kind of concrete actions that we need to take in the field. So I think this is the most important part of our work, is when we reach the reality of our countries and when we are able to implement in reality the goals of protecting human health and the environment.
Thank you. Maybe a quick comment by Dr. Ivanova as well?
Just quickly, there are two parts to implementation. One is the process to get there, and the second is the outcome, is the result. And having a sound process and of monitoring, of creating institutions, of creating legislation is very, very important. And in our work on tracing how countries are implementing, we've come across the example of Barbados in the Basel Convention. Barbados has reported to the Basel Convention every single year for 11 years, and it's not doing very well. And it immediately raises the question, well, why would a country submit a report every single year very systematically, and yet it is not doing very well? And that's an example of someone in the office in Barbados really doing their job. And when I presented these findings to the Small Island Developing States conference, they said, oh yes, we know the guy and he's retiring, but he is putting together a manual for the next person who's going to come over. And it is really important to actually show these examples of people, of countries who are doing their job, and then figure out how we can support these people and these countries and these governments to get them to the final result.
Thank you. Yes? Another question is?
Another question, Nelson Sabogal. I can complement the answer that the colleague from Zimbabwe made, that very useful is how are examples from our secretariat or other secretariats in order to implement better these conventions. But I see there is a good example, the Montreal Protocol. It more or less integrates all the discussions that have here at the panel. It was the efforts of the consumers. They forced the industry to really phase out the CFCs, the aerosols, the people stopped to buy aerosols. The scientists, they discovered the process, and later they discovered also the hole in the ozone layer. But to be sure, there are one issue that came here, and it's very important for developing countries, how the science can help them. And in the case of the Montreal Protocol, the scientific assessment panel, the environmental effects assessment panel, who looks at the impacts of that, and also the technology and economics, with the technologies available and the money needed to change that, to eliminate the production and consumption of this. They elaborated at the end of this report common questions to the public, and they are in the 6 languages. And I see this as a challenge for our COPS review committee, chemicals review committee, at every meeting that they do, to put common questions about these chemicals that we are regulating, who are in the phase to regulate. How the public in general can react in a simple manner, the science from the top to the soil, in order to address this chemical. This was my my comment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So it's again the power of the consumers, but then beyond that, you indeed need an efficient machine, both scientific and then also the policy machine. Thank you for that. Maybe one more question. Yes, we have one more.
Thank you very much. My name is Bondi Gibao from the Stockholm Convention Regional Center in Kuwait. What I have not really had from the panel is the role of industry in preventing future crises. Science seems to be one step behind industry. Industry manufactures these chemicals and they're supposed to provide evidence that these chemicals are safe. But I don't know how responsible industry is in terms of like trying to prevent some of these crises in the future. Currently, the industrial community is spending a lot of money trying to regulate these chemicals, and we have scientists, a panel of scientists that have to look at these chemicals for listing, but there is no such body of scientists trying to look at the effect of these chemicals before they are registered in the first place. I know individual countries have their own policies in terms of registration, but I don't know how useful it would be for you to have a body of scientists, like the Pop Rock, that will look at these chemicals before they're even registered. So that's my question to the panel.
So scientists looking at the, I guess, negative effects even before it's considered for listing. Who would like to react? Or we think it's a good idea? Yes,
I'm happy to. I think that relates to some of the things that I was saying about what are the drivers for research and development, what are they based upon. We have a lot to do with industry, and industry, in fact, is an important stakeholder also in the processes here over these 2 weeks and in the SciCam process. Industry is not going to spend its money and time developing products that are not going to be permitted for use. So they have a very good understanding of regulatory processes, and they will only develop things that they think are going to get through those regulatory processes. What we can do in order to take that further is dialogue with industry and give them a better indication of what is it that society actually wants. What kind of solutions are we looking for? Because, let's take an example. If you have a genetically modified crop which is designed to survive alongside a particular chemical, so that the use of that chemical is going to increase if the use of that crop is increased, that's probably not a great idea for society and not very good in terms of sustainability and use of chemicals. If, on the other hand, genetic engineering is going to develop solutions to problems that are going to reduce the use of chemicals overall and provide solutions to farmers and improve their livelihoods, that might be something that's more interesting to society. So again, looking at end user needs, what are the problems that need solutions, bringing in the policymakers so that they can guide these scientific decisions. Industry is where so much science happens. So absolutely, there is a triangle there that needs to be brought together.
Thank you. Yeah, Lucy, a comment?
I was just going to add to that. I think it's really important that we support innovation, and we support innovation in small companies and in research organisations, because often the sort of big winning solutions don't necessarily come from embedded within the industry. They often come from outside industry. So it's really important that we maintain a good science base, and that we support research and we support innovation to be able to come up with those clean green solutions that we all would like.
Good. Thank you. Well, we only have 10. Yeah. Okay. One last question, and then I'd like to have. Maybe I'll give them the questions, and then I come to you. No. Okay. No. Let's do it the other way. Go for it. Go for your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Christine Föhl, and I'm from the Rotterdam Convention Secretariat and FAO. We have been talking here a lot about the stakeholders, the industry and the consumers. I would like to mention that also the farmers producing our food are a very important stakeholder, and also those can make a real difference. and they have some power. And we have a very good example. And also I want to add that when we talk about science, it's not necessarily the science that is happening in high-tech laboratories or high-tech technologies or whatever. It might be, you know, ancient knowledge that has been forgotten, that needs to be reinvented in a way. And we have a very good example also, to come back to that, under the Rotterdam Convention. We have been working together with farmers, with NGOs, with the Rotterdam Convention Secretariat, in order to find solutions for endosulfan. We have listed that in 2013, and it's one of the most toxic insecticides we know. And it has been used extensively in coffee production. So in Latin America, we have found a solution, or actually the farmers have found a solution, how to produce coffee without endosulfan. And I want to stop here because there is more information at the stand. But again, this coffee produced has also a higher quality, or can achieve higher value on the market, and there again comes the consumer into play. So there the circle closes, and I think this is a real good example, and we would really like to continue with these good examples and work closely together with farmers. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's again about alternatives. I think we're running out of time, and I really would like to have one takeaway from each panelist. But I'm going to make it a little bit more difficult. I'd like you to think of the challenge of your neighbor. Let's say your neighbor from the right. You think of his or her challenge, and you give a solution to his or her challenge. And this will be your takeaway, and all 5 takeaways. Good luck.
Can I start?
Sure.
Since my neighbor to the right actually has a big challenge ahead. The Minamata Convention is taking on exactly these issues in a whole new way. And so I would like to urge Ambassador Lugris to take this science fair, create a science and knowledge fair at the Minamata Convention, that it be expanded beyond science, just building on the last comment, that we have a science and knowledge fair. And secondly, create an implementation monitoring system, that countries know where they stand, that citizens know what is being done, tell the positive stories, and help those that are struggling do better. And to do that, engage science, engage policy, engage NGOs, engage society.
I thank you for that suggestion, and I think it's very much on lessons learned. And I think we have a new convention, we need to do things better, and we need to learn from the sister conventions, BRS, Montreal, and others. And I think Nelson had a very important point. I mean, ozone has been an extraordinary example on how well they have communicated. Everybody understands what we're talking about. We have really made a huge transformation worldwide, and I think we need that level of efficiency worldwide. And talking about lessons learned, the person on my right side has an incredible knowledge from health, from environment, and now Fatou is retired, but I know that she's still very active, and I think her challenge should be how to put all those experience and ideas together to help us worldwide to continue with this goal that will never end until 2020. It will continue to be a goal that we need to continue to push for. And I think the answer to that will be that it's very important that we continue to see all those issues as global issues. So it's very important that the EU has a reach, but it's absolutely fundamental to continue to work on the international cooperation. I think international cooperation remains the answer because the issues are issues of global concern, and even if one region or one country is very efficient implementing all the regulations, they will continue to be affected by pollution because pollution remains an issue of global concern. So we need full implementation of all the instruments, and we need that the goal of sound management of chemicals and waste to be a reality in every single part of the world in order to protect the health and the environment of all of us.
Thank you, Ambassador. Over to you, Fatou.
Thank you. And having nobody on my right hand, I have been thinking, so I thought that I had to address issue raised by Lucy and what she's currently doing, which is really looking around what is around us and what is in us. I think it's important when we give this information to the stakeholder, to the public, that we also come with the accompanying good, positive information of what can be done. And this is a big challenge that science should address. For many years, our discourse on chemicals have been, this is bad, this is not good, etc. But then now it's time to really look at what to do, and what is the benefit of doing what we are saying we should do, and also what are the alternatives to what we are telling them is bad. So I think the conventions have an important role to play in putting together this knowledge, together with the other chemicals program, of the benefits of action and what are the alternatives that we are telling people, so they know when they go home that, yes, I'm going to check in my cupboards and eliminate all these bad things, but then what am I left with? And this is my message.
Good, that's for you, the alternatives in addition to the threats.
Oh no, we totally agree. And actually, when we set up Exxpedition, one of the things we said was that we always wanted to be positive and we wanted to be empowering. And we have got a little takeaway leaflet that's got lots of tips on how to have a plastic and toxic-free lifestyle. So, and hopefully that's communicated in an easy to understand way. So I'm thinking about what the challenge is for my neighbour Mark, and I think it's around feeding a planet and eradicating unsafe chemicals from agricultural system. And one of the things that I think is very, very important is that we look to the design of natural and agricultural systems to increase biodiversity. And I think biodiversity has a lot of the solutions. But one of the challenges is how do we make those systems come into being when we have a system that's very focused on patents and single lines and monocultures. So I see that as a big challenge, but I have come across many examples where biodiversity actually delivers chemical-free or lower chemical systems. So it's promotion of those good solutions. So.
Great. Thank you for that.
Lucy. And then finally, our last takeaway message.
Okay. So I've been thinking about, what does it take to implement conventions more effectively? And I think that the examples that Maria has given have really opened my eyes, certainly, to some of the issues that need to be considered by the parties to these conventions. How are they going to be delivered more effectively? How are they going to actually achieve results, meaningful results, and how are those going to be measured? And it occurs to me that when I go back to Rome from here, where FAO is based, Rome hosts a number of treaties and conventions as well, which probably most of the people in this building don't know about. So I think the message is we need more integration, intersectoriality. We have to have the health and the environment and the agriculture and the industry and the transport sectors talking to each other, so we understand what are the challenges and how do we all play a role in achieving the objectives that are actually benefiting all of us. Because each one of these treaties doesn't really stand on its own. It's part of a complex. And how the pieces of this complex all fit together and influence each other, that understanding is really important. And making sure that the right sectors are all informed and engaged in these processes is essential to their success.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, just for you to know, we will make a summary of the great discussions that we've just had and posted on the BRS website. So we hope that the challenges that were mentioned, but also the solutions, because I think we had both, remain somewhere to feed readers and workers in the chemicals area. I would like to warmly thank all our panelists. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. I think we had an impressive panel today with a lot of interactions, and I also want to thank the audience for your participation and for using your lunch break to come and listen to us. Thanks.